I'm really pleased to invite Pete Nicholas to speak this lunchtime. Pete was an undergraduate here in Oxford, and you'll probably be able to guess when you see him. He won 3 Blues in rugby. Pete has since worked for Christians in Sports, where he led the professional athletes department, and he's now the senior minister for a church in London. Could we welcome Pete to the stage?
Thanks, Joshua, for that kind introduction. I'm not sure quite what to make of. You'll be able to see when he comes to the stage that he got 3 Blues for rugby. Does that mean that my looks have been rather marred over the years? Or the fact that I've lost my hair? I don't know, anyway. Well, we're looking at this issue of relevance today, and it's worth saying as we start, and welcome, by the way, please continue eating as we go through, and there'll be questions at the end that you can kind of fire back. Myself and 2 other wiser individuals as well will be able to field those. But we're looking at this issue of relevance, and my hope is that over the 5 days that I'm here, the 5 lunchtimes, we'll be able to progress through the questions that we've got and that they'll fit together as a whole. So we're looking at relevance today. You know, why does it matter? Because I guess if you're not persuaded that these kind of questions even matter, you won't come back, unless you really like sandwiches. Then we're looking at truth tomorrow. How do we know what is true? What do we mean by the word truth? How can we find out truth in the realm of religion, values, and meaning? Then we're going to be looking at tolerance, because you'll know as well as I do that the moment we start to talk about truth with any conviction, we've got to deal with this issue of how do we make truth claims without being exclusive or intolerant or dismissive of other people who might hold a different opinion. So relevance to truth, to tolerance. Then an interesting one, which we're looking at pleasure. And I think that's really significant because often one of the big questions that people have is, okay, I might be persuaded that there's some element of truth in it, but what does that actually feel like, to inhabit, to be a Christian? Is it just kind of dull and boring, even though it might be true? Or is actually there any kind of experiential, existential kind of benefit for me? And so relevance, truth, tolerance, pleasure, and then last of all, identity, which is a good place to land as we'll be thinking about what does it actually mean for me as a person, as an individual, as a human being, to be putting some of this into practice in my life. So that's where we're going, but we're starting on relevance today. Now, you don't have to be, I guess, particularly up to date with all the cultural commentators to know that we are a culture that's fiercely concerned with the issue of relevance. What is relevant? Who is relevant? We measure it in lots of different ways, don't we? So we have celebrities, A-list through to D or E-list. I don't know, if you read Grazia, you'll be able to fill me in at the end of it. And we have viral videos, what's trending, what's going viral. And we have the kind of top 10 tweets of 2013. And what's interesting is when you look at these kind of cultural trends, what is held up by society as being relevant, it's a kind of curious mix. Looking at last year, the top 3 tweets of last year were a mixture of the sad, the significant, and I put it to you, the kind of titillating but mildly irrelevant. So the sad was the death of Paul Walker, he of Fast and Furious fame, and that was retweeted 400,000 times. The significant were the Boston bombings. When those hit the news, that was retweeted and picked up and put into other tweets 27 million times. That's significant. And then the irrelevant, number 3, any One Direction fans here? Niall Horan turning 20. Now, I've just got a minor issue with Niall Horan. Let's just go with this. This is his tweet when he turned 20. I find this condescending, I've got to be honest. He said, "Yes, I'm 20. It shows." Now, who knows what Niall Horan looks like? As a person who is 35 and conscious that it really does show that I'm 35, the fact that a 20-year-old is saying it shows when they haven't even learned to shave, it's just hardly condescending. I've got an issue with that. But anyway, if you're a One Direction fan, at the end we're going to have a prayer ministry. Pastoral counselling is very important, so please come forward with that. But relevance, it's funny, isn't it? The things we measure as relevant. Now, what I want to look at in the first bit is what I would call the confusion of relevance. Because I think we often assume that we know what we mean by something relevant, and I think we confuse it with what we really understand as just being something that's novel in the true sense of the word, something that's new. Because I think what's happened is, up until the Enlightenment, what was kind of regarded as relevant in a strange way for us to think about now was what was old. The reason that was regarded as what was relevant was because a lot of power was invested in historic, political, religious institutions and texts. And so therefore what you would hold to as being the most relevant thing were those ancient texts. You'll know that as the Enlightenment came around, people started to turn to new texts and to rediscover the originals. And then what became new and what became relevant was the new. The relevant then became the new, because actually the outdated was the old. And so today people often say about Christianity that the problem with Christianity is it's outdated, isn't it? And what they mean by that is you're dealing with a 2,000 or 3,500 year old text, anyway, Old Testament and through to New Testament, and it just can't hold today because it's so old. And so we kind of reject the old in the view that actually what is new is what's really relevant. Now, I think that's a confusion. I think there's a bit of a mistake there, because just because something is new doesn't necessarily make it relevant. The guy, G.K. Chesterton, was a Christian thinker, and he was good on this in terms of outlining the difference between what you could call kind of conservatism, not just political conservative, but general conservatism, and progressivism. And here's a quote that he has on this issue. He said, "The business of progressives is to go on making mistakes as they try new things. The business of conservatives is to prevent mistakes from being corrected. Even when the revolutionist might himself repent of his revolution, the traditionalist is already defending it as part of his tradition. And so we have two great types or movements in history. The advanced person, who rushes us into ruin in the name of progression, and the retrospective person, who admires those ruins once they've been accomplished." What he's saying is, let me break it down, what he's saying is this. He's saying today we're so concerned with being progressive, of getting to the latest thing, that the latest idea is automatically assumed to be relevant, and if it contradicts an older idea, we just write off the old idea. And anyone who's a kind of conservative with a capital C in the general sense of the word, we kind of think, get with the program. And so therefore for me, when I was an undergraduate here and I wasn't a Christian, I'm not from a Christian background, I kind of thought, why would you go back to an ancient text when there's so much more ideas around that are bound to be better on? I mean, after all, aren't we progressing all the time and getting further on? And so we write off Christianity as often being irrelevant because it contradicts our culture around us. But here's the problem. Christianity has always been culturally contradictory, to a degree. One of the great appeals of Jesus Christ was that he was actually a cultural transformer. He did contradict the norms of the culture around him. And thank goodness he did. He challenged entrenched attitudes towards gender and sexuality of his day. He challenged entrenched opinions about religious power resting with an elite and a few. He challenged entrenched positions about marginalisation and those who had disability and who were weak and marginalised in society. He challenged the culture, and thank goodness he did. And therefore, if he challenged the culture then, and that was part of his appeal, then we need to be careful of saying, well, because it's different to what we might expect today, we just write it off as being irrelevant. I think that's to confuse the new or the progressive with the truly relevant. C.S. Lewis makes the point that actually progression implies not just moving forward, that isn't progression, that's just movement. Progression implies moving forward towards a goal. And the big question is, are you getting closer towards the goal? Because if you're moving away from your goal, you're not progressing, you're regressing. And you need to turn around and go back the other way. So here's the big question. As we think about these issues of truth and pleasure and identity, are we getting closer towards our goal, or are we getting further away? Is our culture progressing us in the true sense of the word, or is it regressing us? And that implies a standard by which to evaluate. So let's be very careful to talk about it with the confusion of relevance. Secondly, though, the timelessness of relevance. The French thinker Simone Weil said this: if you want to be always relevant, you have to be eternal. Only the eternal can be eternally relevant. That sounds very clever, doesn't it? I mean, I did a joint honours in rugby and PPE, so you can figure out that when it comes to philosophy, I've got kind of thin spatterings of the thing. But what she's saying, I think, is this. She's saying that actually the big issues in life are the timeless issues. They're the issues that come up time and time again, that every culture's got to deal with. These are the big questions in life. They're the eternal questions. They transcend culture. It's not just dealt with because one culture thinks it's important. Every culture needs to deal with these. And I'm really grateful that the talks that are being put on and given to me to do this week, I think are dealing with some of, not all of, but some of those big questions. And here's the thing, maybe you'll come and you think, well look, I'm here because someone dragged me along so there's free food, but I'm not sure I'm really persuaded these are the big issues for me. I think they are, whether you're conscious of them or not. What is true? How do we know truth? That's a big question. Every culture's got to ask that. Who am I? My identity? What constitutes my identity? That's a big question that you'll be making key decisions in life now and in the face of the future as you think that through. Pleasure, what is the good life? What is the best way to live? Value and ethics, that's what we're going to be exploring these lunchtimes. And they're important because they're eternal questions. They're not just important because we as a culture have cherry-picked them and said, let's deal with those. And what's kind of interesting is, I'm going to be looking at the Bible, you'd expect that in a talk when we're thinking about kind of Christian theology, Christian philosophy, is that what's interesting is when Jesus comes on the scene, he claims to deal with exactly those kind of big macro questions. I want to take just an incident from the beginning of the Gospel of John. Actually, each lunchtime, we're just going to refer to a little instance from the Gospel of John. And what's kind of unusual in this incident is that there's a guy called Nathaniel, he's got a friend, and his friend goes to Nathaniel, and he claims to have met the Messiah. Now, the Messiah means the anointed one, it means God's anointed king. So, basically, the claim is like this, it's kind of wandering along saying, you know the guy that 1,500 years of Bible has been written about? You know, the person who's the great climax of history. The one that everyone knows is going to have all the answers to all of life's big questions. Well, he's arrived, and he's living around the corner in Nazareth. Now, Nazareth is like some obscure Galilean backwater, so that is an unusual claim. But what's interesting is no one thinks it's an irrelevant claim, because this is the guy who's going to have all the answers. Let me just read a little passage. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now, Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathaniel and said, here it is, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nathaniel said to him, "Nazareth? Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Well, come and see." Jesus saw Nathanael coming towards him and said of him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" Jesus answered, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Nathanael then answered, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered, "Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these." Now what's going on here? Well, he's saying that the most relevant thing for them at that time is the Messiah. When the Messiah arrives, because he's going to be the one who's going to bring all the answers. And Philip is making this astonishing claim to Nathanael. He says he's living around the corner in Nazareth. Now Philip, is making that claim. Nathanael's interested. He kind of dismisses it. He goes, "Nazareth? You've got to be kidding me. What? The one with all the answers to all of life's big questions. The great solution to history. He's living around the corner. What's wrong? What, have you been drinking something, smoking? What's going on with you?" See, he just dismisses it. But it's interesting, he does go. And I think that's interesting because that actually takes us right to the heart of what I call the paradox of relevance, which is when something that's really relevant comes along, you'll be tempted to dismiss it because it will be a paradigm shift. Let me explain what I mean. Usain Bolt, at high school, his high school coach said what? He said he'll never be a good sprinter, his legs are too long, he needs to switch to the middle distance or to the high jump. Now that was a mistake, wasn't it? I mean, I don't know that he went on to have a great career in athletics or anything, so that was a mistake for that coach. Now why did he say that? Well, because the conventional wisdom up to that point was that if you were long and lanky, you couldn't have the fast-twitch fibers to make you an effective sprinter. That was the conventional wisdom. Now have you noticed over the last 10 years that every sprinter who's coming out is suddenly trying to be really tall because actually Usain Bolt has been the paradigm shift in our thinking of athletics. Here's another one. A newspaper in America wrote this in 1865 about the telephone. I love this. This is a great quote. "Well-informed people know that it is impossible to transmit voice over wires, and that were it possible, it would be of absolutely no practical use or value to the modern world." Isn't that brilliant? You see, it was a paradigm shift. The idea of, it replacing the telegram or the letter. You've got to be kidding, it's never going to catch on. In 2006, a technology newspaper reported that the iPhone was unlikely to be able to gain a substantial market share. That's egg on your face, isn't it? And then you think about even in politicians. Winston Churchill was dismissed initially as being an irrelevance because he kept going on and on about this guy called Adolf Hitler and saying he was the great threat to the peace of the Western world. Dismissed. And then, of course, once the Second World War started, everyone started knocking down his door. Incidentally, you've got to love Winston Churchill. He'd never get away with the things that he said, nowadays, would he? He just had this knack for saying the completely politically incorrect. So there was this poor woman called Bessie Braddock in the House of Parliament, and they had this kind of sparring partner relationship. She didn't like him very much, and apparently one day, and the policeman who was there, kind of testified this was true, and as we all know, when it comes to Parliament, you can definitely trust the police. And they reported that apparently she turned round to Winston Churchill one day in the bar and she said, "Sir, you are drunk, and what is more, you are disgustingly drunk." He said, "Madam, you are ugly, but fortunately I will be sober in the morning." And so she retorted to the guy, she said, "Sir, that is outrageous. If I were your wife, I would poison your tea." He said, "Madam, if you were my wife, I would drink that tea gladly." You get away with that. Just don't. So it was an irrelevance. Winston Churchill initially thought of it as an irrelevance, but then he becomes fiercely relevant. And the reason is because his initial reason that people rejected him was precisely what made him so relevant. And this is what happens with Christianity. I put it to you that the reason it's often in such tension with our culture is because it does contradict lots of points in our culture. And actually this claim that Philip is making to Nathaniel here is quite astonishing. When he says that the Messiah is living around the corner, think of what he's saying. He's saying that the great answers to life are not found in a philosophy, they're found in a person. Now that is contradictory to most of our culture. We think that actually if I study here at Oxford or if I investigate these philosophies, I will find the great answers to life. The claim at the heart of Christianity is the great answers to life are found in a person, not a philosophy, not a doctrine, a person, the person of Jesus Christ. So no wonder Nathaniel has some problems with that. The second claim that's made is that you can't figure out the answers to these big questions of life on your own. You need God to step in and do something about it. It's the difference between trying to figure it out yourself and what theologians call revelation, something being revealed to you. You see, Philip is saying this to Nathaniel, the Messiah has come to you, you don't need to go to him. He stepped down into space-time and history to give you the answers to life. You don't need to try and sit there and figure them out in some kind of exercise of mysticism or rationalism or empiricism. God's revealed them to you in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. That's the claim. No wonder, again, people push back and say, whoa, 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 that's not what I expected. And the third part of the claim is that the Messiah is hiding out in a place called Nazareth, which is an obscure little backwater. That is, that when the answers to life come, they don't come impressively, they don't come in glory and in majesty with the kind of, written in the neon lights. The great answers to life come in a person who comes in humility, who comes in weakness, who lives a very humble and simple life, and dies a very tragic death on the cross. And that is what brings the revelation about these great questions and answers to life to us. And so no wonder Nathaniel pushed back. He said, what? Nazareth? Can anything good come from Nazareth? But notice what's interesting here is Nathaniel goes along. I wonder if you noticed that. It's just when I read it out. Nathaniel's quite an interesting guy, isn't it? I mean, he kind of slates his mate a little bit. No, Nazareth. Can anything good come from Nazareth? Philip says to him, come and see. And he goes along. Now, I don't know whether that's connecting with you right now, because, you had a friend say, come and hear this talks that's going on this week. And you said, talks? Christians? Really? He said, come along, there's free food. You're like, and then they dogged you and they persuaded you, so you're here. Anyway, maybe you feel a little bit like Nathaniel. You're here and you kind of wish you weren't here now, or who knows, don't walk out yet. But Nathaniel goes. He goes. And I just want to say a little bit about his attitude, because what that shows you is it shows you two things. It shows you he's skeptical, which is fair enough. He's not gullible. He's skeptical, not gullible. But he's also open. And as I close, I want to suggest that this week, you're going to get the best out of this week and these talks if you come with that attitude. See, here's the problem. If you come just gullible, your friend says to you, I've got all the answers to life, come and read the Bible, and you just kind of go, well, great, I'll believe anything. The problem with that is you'll just end up yo-yoing between different doctrines. Anyone makes a truth claim, you'll go with it. So you might come across quite nice, but you'll just end up always battered around and moved around. So come and ask your questions, please. By the way, I became a Christian because my friend said to me, look into it. And I said, if I look into it, I'll disprove it. And they said, go on then. Look into it, ask your questions. I was revising for my finals at the time. I actually stopped. I took a month out of my finals. I don't recommend that. It panicked my parents. But anyway, and I didn't do great as a result of it. But there we go. I did write rugby, so that's okay. But, the thing is, I stopped and I asked my questions, and I just said, if it's true, it will stand up to scrutiny. So I don't need to be nervous about asking my questions. I spend most of my life going around saying to people, look, if you've got questions, brilliant, Christianity's for you. Ask your questions. Please don't ever hear a Christian saying, don't ask questions. We're not a type of community that likes questions. If you've had that impression of Christianity, it's rubbish. If it's true, it will stand up to scrutiny. Come with your questions, please. That's why we put the Q&A on afterwards. And that's why I'd love you to keep coming back to the talks throughout the week. But be careful, right? Because the thing is, there's a difference between an open skepticism and what I'd call a dismissive skepticism. And the dismissive skepticism is, well, that can't possibly be true, and you roll your eyes and you kind of walk out the door. But you don't have, and if I can put it generally, because I don't know you personally, you don't have the personal integrity to really kick the tires on it, to really look at it. Someone has said that the problem with Christianity is not that it's been tried and tested and found wanting, but that too often it's been left untested. Test it. Please, look at the Bible. Look at the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Ask your questions. And as you look at it, I'm pushing it to you that you wouldn't find it to be irrelevant, but the big question is it true? Does it stack up to scrutiny? So come with your skepticism, but make it an open skepticism. Don't be gullible, come with your questions, but be open about the way you question. And that's what Nathaniel does. He comes along, he asks his questions, and as he comes to investigate, he meets the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And it is that person, not a doctrine, not a philosophy, that really persuades him. Before we turn to your questions, let me just leave you with this quote from C.S. Lewis. And he puts it much better than I could, so I've got no shame in quoting him. He wrote this: "It is always shocking to meet life where we thought we were alone. Look out, we cry, it's alive, and therefore this is the very point when so many people draw back. I would have done so myself if I could, and would have proceeded no further with Christianity. An impersonal God, well and good. A subjective God of beauty, truth, goodness inside our own heads, better still. A formless life force surging through us, a vast power which we can tap into, best of all. But God himself, God alive, pulling at the other end of the cord, perhaps approaching at an infinite speed, the hunter, king, husband, that is quite another matter. There comes a moment when the children who have been playing at burglars hush suddenly. Did we just hear a real footstep in the hall? There comes a moment when people who have been dabbling in religion as man's search for God suddenly draw back. Supposing we really found him. We never meant it to come to that. Worse still, supposing he had found us." I'm privileged that 14 years ago I was sitting in St Eb's Church when a guy called Reverend Zacharias was speaking, and he opened up some of these issues to me, and I sat there and I thought, yeah, I wonder what would happen if I looked into this. And as I looked into it, I came to it with skepticism, but it was an open skepticism. I'm grateful I did. I'm grateful I had friends who pushed me and cajoled me and talked to me and took time with me. I hope you've got friends like that. But please keep coming back this week, because I pitch it to you that because it's eternal, it can never be irrelevant. But the big question is it true? And for that, you need to investigate the person of Jesus Christ. So come along this week, come along to the evenings. We're going to take some questions in a moment, but thanks so much for listening.
Okay, let's start the question and answer time. I'd like to invite Sharon and Pete, who work for local churches, to join Pete for the question and answer. Could we have our first question, please? So the first question is, what if I don't feel like I need an answer to the big questions?
I guess there's a difference between whether you feel you do or whether you actually do. And I guess one of my points that I probably would make out a bit more time to develop it is that we're all working out these kind of questions, whether we realise it or not. So Socrates famously said that the only life worth living is the examined life. And the reason he said that is not because he was a kind of philosophical elitist, though he might have been, I don't know, I didn't meet the guy, but it's because what he's saying is that actually the reason these are big questions is because actually you can't do life without them. So even if you say, well, I don't think there's any such thing as truth, that itself is a truth claim. And if you just make it kind of casually off the cuff, you will order your life according to it. Now, therefore, you want to think, actually, on what basis am I making those claims? Where do I get those things from? Your identity, who am I? You're forming that right now. We form it throughout our lives, but largely, most sociologists kind of, think that it's formed by your early 20s. And these are big things that you want to be thinking through. Now, whether you realise it or not, I guess I'd push back and say you are making life decisions on the back of it. And the question for you is whether you'll examine those assumptions or whether you're just going to coast through, maybe influenced by culture, maybe influenced by your parents, maybe influenced by lots of other different things. But unexamined, do you really want to just go through life making massive decisions on the basis of foundations you've never really looked at? You would never buy a house on that basis, to use Andy's illustration. You would never not look at the foundations and ask the questions. So would you be so reckless as to go through life just saying, well, I think it'll work out all right for me in the end? Please just take the time. You've got a unique opportunity here at university to take the time to do that. But I think you can't do life without these questions. It's just whether you're assuming them or whether you're actually examining them.
Great, next question please. Don't all religions tackle eternal questions?
I guess quite a lot of them do. It seems to me that Jesus has a unique answer in that Jesus claims that only in him can we be acceptable to God. So generally speaking, all the religions function on the basis of doing certain things to be acceptable. And yet Jesus alone says that's not the case. To be acceptable to God eternally involves trusting what he's done for us. And so there's a unique claim there in terms of actually how we can be acceptable to God for eternity.
And the other thing I'd add there is that what Pete was saying earlier about it's not just believing a doctrine, so what this Pete was saying is about believing a person. Other religions tackle eternal questions, but very rarely will they talk about that eternal question being relational and personal. And so not just what is good, what is a good life, or what do you do with suffering. Lots of religions will tackle those questions, and some will say, for example, about suffering, well, that is just a figment of your imagination, you need to move on through that. Well, with all these big questions in Christianity, it's deeply personal because it's found in a person, the revelation of God in Jesus Christ, and then saying, what do you do with Jesus? Will you be reconciled with the maker of the universe? So it's relationally handled.
Thanks, Sharon. Next question, please. Pete, you said progression is moving towards a goal. How do we know what goal we should be aiming for? And how do we know whether we're moving towards or away from it?
Great question. Thank you very much. Yeah. So that's exactly, partly that's the kind of the point of this initial talk is on what basis you do. Let's just go with a few different places. You can look for the goal, to whether you're moving towards it. You can look around at culture. The problem is if you say my culture defines ultimately what is progressive and what is regressive, is that, with any degree of humility, once you've travelled a bit, you'll realise that cultures have very different takes on a lot of these questions. And so therefore, you kind of go to a cultural relativism where, unless you're pretty culturally proud, you have to say, well, their potential answer, which is different to mine, is just as valid as mine if it's just culture. Why would my culture, be the right culture when there are big answers? So I think cultural relativism is difficult. You just have to shrug your shoulders and say, no one culture can have the ideal answer about what is right. You can say, well, myself, I'll try and work out what the ultimate goal is, but you wake things up in the morning, you feel different ways, you get things wrong, you go into tutorials. By the way, if you haven't figured out you get things wrong, you probably haven't been in a tutorial this term, and shame on you, should go. But as you go along and you try your answers, you just know you make mistakes. So how can you be the reference point for the goal? The individual. So culture, individual, you might go with a particular institution, but again, isn't that just a microcosm of a culture, a vested idea? So the big question is, where are you going to go? And I put it to you that if there's a God, he will be the one who will be able to uniquely define what is progressive and what is regressive. Because if he made the world, he knows it, and therefore he knows the goals for us. So that is why we're putting on these talks, is so we can explore it. But do come back to the other talks. That's not just a pitch because I don't want to be here talking to an empty building, but it's because we're saying that over the course of this week we're going to be building the case that actually the Christian claims are unique and uniquely give us that point of reference that we can evaluate things from.
Great, next question please. As far as I can remember, limited memory, the Old Testament describes various aspects of the Messianic age, such as no more disease, etc., which haven't happened. Does that make Jesus not the Messiah, or is the Old Testament wrong, or am I wrong?
So Jesus claims to be the fulfillment of the promises in the Old Testament, and yet what we see is that his coming comes in two stages. So he comes once, and he'll come again. And he won't fully fulfill those promises until he comes again. So he says he comes first to save, and now is the time when he offers salvation, and he'll come finally to judge and to put things right. But those promises won't be fully fulfilled until he comes again.
Thanks, Pete. Next question. What packs more power? A punch from Andy Croft or a headbutt from Pete Nicholas?
That is poor. That is poor. I don't know. I know Crofty looks quite nimble on his feet, doesn't he? I don't think I'd be able to catch him. That would be the big problem, to be running rings around me. So we'll see. I tell you what, come along and you can evaluate. And if we get enough feedback, it could be like celebrity deathmatch on the last evening. I don't know. It's up to you.
Next question. No more questions.
Great, that's all we've got time for today. Thanks very much. Can we give our question panel a round of applause?